Good day everyone, so this video is going to be about your spinal cord, nerves, and tracts. So what exactly is the spinal cord? Well, this is a part of your central nervous system that is housed within your vertebral canal or within your spinal canal of your vertebra. It starts at the level of the foramen magnum up until the level of L1 to L2 in adults. For its diameter, it is about 10 to 15 millimeters, and for the spinal canal, in which it is located inside of, it is 17 millimeters. So the spinal cord is gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside, and its length is 42 to 45 centimeters. Also, we have here your spinal nerve exits. So for the cervical levels, always remember the mnemonic cervelo. This means that if you are asked which spinal nerve exits between a level of the spinal cord, it is always the lower level for the cervical region. So for example, if you're asked what exits between C4 and C5, the C5 spinal nerve exits through there. For the thoracic level and below, it is your thoracic. So when you are asked which spinal nerve exits between certain thoracic levels, it is always the level above. So if you're asked what exits between T6 and T7, it will be T6. With the exemption of the levels for L4 and L5, so what exits between those is L5. And between L5 to S1, it is the S1 spinal nerve that exits between those levels. Now let's talk about external anatomy of the spinal cord. Here on the left side, you can see that there are dilations or enlargements within your spinal cord. So this is found at the level of your cervical region and your lumbar region. And the reason why there are enlargements in these regions are because they contain your plexuses, or your plexuses arise from these levels and supply your upper limbs and the muscles of your lower limbs. For picture C on the left side, you can also see that there are your meninges that protect and support your spinal cord, which are still continuous with that of your brain. So you have the same levels, your dura mater, arachnoid mater, and your pia mater. So in the same order still. What is also additional to see is that you have your denticulate ligaments, which are these ligaments that adhere to your spinal cord to protect them better and to anchor them in place. Aside from that, looking at the bottom areas of your spinal cord, you have your conus medullaris, which is the conical pointed tip of your spinal cord, and it is found there is your center for micturition, or the reflex level S2 to S4 for micturition or urination. Next, you have your filum terminale, which is this long element of pia mater connecting your spinal cord to the coccyx bone. And then you have your cauda equina, which are just a collection of lumbosacral roots known as your horse's tail. So your cauda equina is actually part of the lower motor neuron. So if this gets damaged, this is not considered to be a spinal cord injury anymore. So here are your three meninges as well as the spaces found in between them. Next, you have a cross-section of your spinal cord. Anteriorly, you find your anterior median fissure, and posteriorly, you find your posterior median sulcus. Now let's talk about the gray matter found inside your spinal cord. So the gray matter is comprised of cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons, and is divided into horns. So the posterior aspect, you call that as your posterior or dorsal horns, and they mainly function for sensory integration. And then for the anterior portion, you call that as your anterior or ventral horn, and that is for motor function. And lastly, you have your lateral horn. So this is mainly for autonomic nervous system function or integration. Aside from that, you also have your four regions, your somatic sensory, visceral motor, and somatic motor. So these are just a collection of neurons and cell bodies found within these areas. Next, you have your white matter. So these are myelinated axons, giving them the impression of the color white. It has three columns or funiculi. So these are the counterparts to the gray matter horns. In the white matter, these are called columns. They may also be called funiculi, and you have three. Your ventral or your anterior funiculi or column, your dorsal, and then you have your lateral. So these contain different kinds of fibers. You have your ascending fibers for your sensory tracts, your descending fibers for your motor tracts, and your commissural or transverse fibers for your gray and white commissure. So for the blood supply of the spinal cord, this comes from the circle of Willis in your brain and is continuous up until the spinal cord through your anterior and your posterior spinal arteries. So for your posterior spinal artery, it supplies the posterior 1/3 of the spinal cord, and your anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord. You also have little branches of arteries, your segmental spinal arteries, and your radicular arteries. So these supply certain levels of your spinal cord and certain portions, like your spinal nerves. And then you have the very important artery of Adam-Cuix. So this supplies the lower 2/3 of the spinal cord. So it is the large and important feeder artery of your spinal cord. For the venous supply, it is coming from your internal vertebral venous plexus. Now let's talk about the nerves arising from your spinal cord. So these are considered peripheral nerves, and we specifically call them as your spinal nerves. So they come from your spinal cord through your ventral and dorsal rootlets, your ventral and dorsal roots that may contain your dorsal root ganglion, and eventually that will merge and become your spinal nerve. First, we have your motor or ventral nerve fibers. Its origin comes from your anterior horn cell and leaves the spinal cord through your anterior nerve root. So these cell bodies are located in your anterior horn cell, brainstem, and the cortex. Next, we have your sensory dorsal or posterior nerve fibers. These originate from the neurons in your posterior or dorsal root ganglia, or your DRG, and it enters the cord through your posterior nerve root. So the cell bodies of these are found in the cortex and in the ganglion around the origins of the sensory nerve. So in other words, your ventral or anterior nerve fibers are pure motor, and your dorsal or posterior nerve fibers are pure sensory nerves. These two structures merge together and create a mixed spinal nerve. So these mixed spinal nerves will eventually go together and become your plexuses, which is why they supply motor and sensory functions. So here we have our first plexus. It's your cervical plexus, supplied by spinal nerves from C1 up until C4 or C5. This plexus supplies muscles and skin to the head, neck, superior shoulders, and chest. Next, you have your brachial plexus, comprised of the roots from your spinal nerves C5 to C8 and T1. So this supplies your upper extremity muscles and sensation. Next, you have your lumbar plexus from the roots of L1 up until L4. So this supplies some of the muscles for your lower extremity. And the last plexus we have is your sacral plexus. So this is comprised of the roots from spinal nerves L4 to L5 and S1 to S4. That's the end of the first half of the discussion. Part 2 will be about the spinal cord tracts.